Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Economics and Society Webinar Series 2026, a collaboration between European Students for Liberty and Foundation for Economic Education. Our speaker today is Marcus Wichon, historian and co-author of the book Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, Hope, Heartbreak, and the Promise of America. In his work, he challenges the idea of social progress comes wholly from government action. Instead, they show Black entrepreneurs, mutual aid societies, and voluntary institutions used markets to build independence, dignity, and economic foundations of civil rights movement. Today's talk, Black Entrepreneurship, the Foundation of Civil Rights, draws directly from this research and invites us to rethink how liberty, enterprise, and social progress connect both historically and today. Please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A box during the talk. We will address as many as possible at the end. With that, it's a pleasure to welcome Marcus Wichon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I've done work with Fee for years, but very excited to partner with folks across the globe to bring these ideas to a wider audience. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully, we don't have any issues there. Let me see here. Should be good. Are we good?
Yes.
Awesome. So the talk today, as a sort of
Um,
introduction alluded to, is about Black entrepreneurship and the ways in which Black Americans used markets to try and overcome state-sanctioned discrimination. I'll try not to assume too much knowledge about American history and sort of American politics as we go along. But if you do have a question pertaining to those, please drop it in the chat and we can address it in the Q&A. My hope today is to speak for about 40 minutes or so and to allow ample opportunity at the end of the session for questions and whatnot. So I always frame this talk, which is derived from my book with Rachel Ferguson titled Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, by asking the audience a simple question or by sort of positing this sort of historical occurrence, if you will. In 1905 or so, there were a series of streetcar boycotts by Black Americans. They took to the streets and they protested against what they believed was, and which was, unjust segregation practices across the American South on streetcars. Unfortunately, in 1905, those protests failed by and large. They did not succeed in desegregating the streetcars across the American South in 1905. And yet, 50 years later, in 1955, when Black Americans came together in Montgomery, Alabama, right, famously Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Black Americans were much more successful, right? They successfully carried out a boycott against the segregated buses in Montgomery, Alabama, and achieved success. So, what changed from 1905 to 1955 that enabled that type of success? Our answer is Black entrepreneurship through the market, that they built a foundation, Black Americans did, that enabled them to create the institutions, networks, etc., and wealth that enabled them to carry out the first successful campaign in the civil rights movement. And so today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that history. Oftentimes, when US students learn about civil rights history, they learn about the Civil War, the sort of, Civil War uh, constitutional amendments, which granted Black Americans obviously their freedom, but also the right to vote and their civil rights. And then we sort of have this like gap, if you will, until we get to 1955. It's like, oh, slavery ended, and then there was the civil rights movement. Well, why was there the need for a civil rights movement? Because from 1870 to 1955, it was actually a really bleak time in American history for Black Americans. And they had to use what institutions were available to them and what means were available to them, mainly markets and voluntary association, to try and overcome state-sanctioned discrimination. So let's get started. I always begin this talk on a somewhat sad note. So I think this talk overwhelmingly is uplifting. I think it's a really positive message about the power of individuals to come together into voluntary associations and to fight for freedom, justice, liberty, and rights. But the reality is that in 1875, when the sort of Jim Crow era sort of sets in after federal troops are withdrawn from the American South through a series of compromises, The United States is actually a very deeply racist nation. So I think people sometimes think that like racism was the worst the furthest back you go in history, and that's not necessarily the case. It actually got worse around 1830 and really accelerated in terms of sort of the severity of racism in and around the 1870s through the Progressive Era in the 1930s and 40s. And it wouldn't be until Hitler and sort of fascism is discredited, at least for a long period of time, right? The idea that sort of racial supremacy. So it actually crescendos, if you will, in the 1870s or so, and we see across the American South and across the United States a series of institutions put into place. Jim Crow is the most well known to people, right? Separate but equal, quote unquote, facilities for people based upon their race. But it's actually far worse than that. The United States actually had a system of convict leasing in places like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and elsewhere, where basically private corporations would purchase quote unquote convicts who disproportionately happened to be black men. That was not a coincidence. And they would work in the factories or in the mines in the developing South. And they actually faced conditions that some historians have described as worse than what they experienced under slavery. And so I want to sort of lay that sort of context out there for you as we begin talking about some of the individuals who are combating this oppression, because I think in some ways it's so much worse than what we remember it being. And it's important context, especially for one of the first individuals that we're going to be talking about, Booker T. Washington. So Booker T. Washington was born a slave. His family moved to West Virginia, which had seceded from Virginia during the Civil War itself. And Booker T. Washington grows up in West Virginia, right in the aftermath of the Civil War. His family's extremely poor. He has to work as a young man, as a child. He has to work in the mines, and he finally negotiates with his stepfather to allow him to go and get an education, which he achieves while also working probably about 30 to 40 hours a week as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old in the mines, which is extraordinarily difficult work. But Booker T is an exceptional student. And Booker T very early on gets noticed by people who ultimately provide him a scholarship to go and study at the Hampton Institute. And that time that he spent at the Hampton Institute, which was mainly focused on vocational training, very similar to what Tuskegee, the college he's going to ultimately go on to run, had trained him up, but also gave him a network of people who believed in him enough that when in 1881, the state of Alabama, facing a tremendous amount of shame, decided to allocate a small amount of resources for the establishment of a black-only college in the state. Booker T. Washington ends up being the person who's asked to go to the heart of Dixie, right, and to found an all-black college focused on training teachers predominantly, and also training young black Alabamians in sort of vocational training. Booker T. Washington arrives in Alabama and he faces extraordinarily difficult odds. State-sanctioned discrimination is the norm. The Constitution of Alabama is about to be rewritten to erase black civil rights. Um, you are arriving at a time at the height of sort of, racism and discrimination against Black Americans. Many, many, many Americans believed that blacks were so inferior to whites that they would literally die out because of sort of natural selection reasons. I can't describe to you the amount of racism that Booker T. Washington faced as he returned to Alabama and the amount of hostility that there was among the white population there. But he founds the Tuskegee Institute. It's got one building initially. He, the faculty, and the students have to literally build the institution from the ground up against immeasurable odds, right? They are able to do it. They experiment with different sort of like combinations to come up with a brick, because Alabama actually wasn't a great place. Bricks were very expensive; they had to be imported. So they actually, after 3 or 4 attempts, are able to put together and make their own Tuskegee bricks, which then they start selling to the white community. Right, part of Booker T. Washington's larger vision of how we can potentially, white and black Alabamians, benefit one another through mutual exchange and trade. But they literally had to build Tuskegee from the ground. And they did that successfully. By 1890, right, Tuskegee is rolling and serving hundreds of students every year. And those students, like I said, are primarily going to end up being teachers who go out back into the community, build their own little one-bedroom schoolhouses with no resources from the state, and try to provide elementary education to Black Southerners. It should be noted that during this time, from 1870 to 1900, Black Americans experienced the greatest, and most dramatic leap in literacy in world history, we believe. They went from something like 10% of the population being literate to something like 80 to 90% of the population being literate in just 30 to 35 years. And they did it without state funding for education. They were that committed, right, to education. They thought family, God, and education were the recipes to success moving forward for them as a people. Washington is a builder and he's a leader. And when Frederick Douglass passes away, Frederick Douglass, of course, the most famous, right, abolitionist, was the leader, quote unquote, of his race. The mantle of leader of the race gets passed on to Booker T. Washington. And in some ways, this is a real challenge. Douglass had lived in the North, right? He hadn't faced the same types of constraints that Booker T. Washington faced in the American South. If Booker T. Washington, as leader of the race, speaks out too forcefully about Black Americans needing political equality, he might find himself faced with a white lynch mob. So he has to be much more strategic and much more careful about how he goes about advocating for Black civil liberties and political rights. But as I said, he's now the leader of the race. He's the president of the Tuskegee Institute. He's going to bring in money from the great industrialists like Carnegie and Rockefeller to help fund Black colleges across the country. He's also a builder, though, of voluntary associations. He truly believes that markets are important, trade is important, exchange is important, but also that community and associations and what we call civil society, that level between government and the private sphere, right, where we come together to do things together as a community, but it's not government. Civil society was the key to Black uplift, along with markets. And so he founded the Alabama State Teacher Association, which brought teachers from all over Alabama and eventually all over the surrounding areas, the surrounding states, to come and talk about, hey, what challenges are you facing? How do you get around not having any textbooks? What do you do when the local whites get upset that you're educating young Black kids? How do you respond to that? What are some good tactics? It was the first teacher association of its kind in the United States. In 1892, he founded the Tuskegee Negro Conference, which was similar to the Alabama State Teacher Association, but it brought together people in all sorts of other trades. So farmers, lawyers, bankers, right? Black Americans were working in an array of different occupations. They had been sort of shut out from white financial institutions, and so they formed their own. And so what Booker T envisioned here with the Tuskegee Negro Conference was, let's get everybody together who has different sort of ideas, who has different resources, different networks, and let's connect everyone so that people can get access to the types of resources that they need, whether that's a small loan from a Black-owned bank, or whether it's knowledge about crop rotation, etc. And so that turned out to be a tremendous success as well. And it became the foundation for what Washington founded in 1900, the National Negro Business League, which was at the national level, what the Tuskegee Negro Conference had been, and expanded, if you will. And its goal was to bring Black business leaders together to, quote, promote the commercial and financial development of the Negro, okay, end quote, right? Using the language of the time. So pardon me for that. But that was sort of the vision of Washington's business league, which would continue to exist on into the 20th century for an extended period of time, bringing entrepreneurs, industrialists, etc., together to talk and to work with one another towards Black betterment. I could talk about Booker T. Washington all day. This talk is one of those talks that can be 30 minutes long or it can be an hour and 15 minutes long. So I will try to be disciplined here. I just want to say that Booker T. Washington is almost always labeled an accommodationist in history textbooks, claiming that, his vision for Black uplift was working in the economic sphere, creating useful skills, and then demonstrating to white Southerners that Black Americans were respectable and useful. And his hope was that once white Southerners saw that Black Southerners were useful and respectable, that white Southerners would grant them their civil and political liberties. And publicly, Washington at times said things that definitely sound accommodationist. But behind the scenes, Washington's actually doing a lot to fight for Black civil liberties, including political liberties. He funds a series of lawsuits against extraordinarily racist and exclusionary state constitutions. Those lawsuits ultimately fail, but they provide sort of a foundation for what the NAACP would do later on. And so oftentimes Washington is condemned, but the reality is that a lot of what Washington was doing was happening behind the scenes because he also had to think about his students and his faculty and his institution. And he couldn't afford, right, to put those people in danger. So that's probably enough about Washington. We'll probably say a little bit more as we go. But Washington, I think, and his vision for using markets, for encouraging Black Americans to be entrepreneurial and building civil society and voluntary associations, I believe is actually the foundation for the civil rights movement. Not to discount the efforts of W.B. Du Bois and others who I think had legitimate means to fight oppression as well. But I think this is a really, really pivotal part of the story that's often overlooked by our friends on the left, who are maybe a little bit more suspicious of markets and private property. One of the greatest examples of success within this sort of market economy is Madam C.J. Walker. And once again, I don't want to spend too much time here, could talk the whole time about Madam C.J. Walker and the amazing, amazing empire that she built. She was born Sarah Breedlove, enslaved, and she was the first part of her life, she gets married, she has a daughter. She's not doing very well financially. She's sort of kind of trapped into she's a washerwoman and she's kind of trapped into she's not going anywhere in terms of her career. And one day she's washing some white woman's clothes, and it just sort of, she has this epiphany. She claims that God came and talked to her, but she has this epiphany, right? That like, hey, I can't be doing this forever. Her hair was beginning to fall out, probably because of nutritional issues, but perhaps also hygiene issues, which many, many Americans had in and around that time. Was not unique to her around the turn of the century or a little before. And what she does is she actually discovers the hair products of a woman named Annie Malone. And she goes to Annie Malone and she uses her product first and it works miracles for her scalp and for her hair. And she is so impressed with the product that she goes to Annie Malone and she says, I can sell your product for you better than anybody else. I am the best example of what this can do for someone in terms not only of their physical appearance, but also of their sort of emotional well-being, right? Her confidence, etc. And to her credit, Annie Malone gave her an opportunity and she went out and she started selling those products. That gave her an opportunity to not only make some money, but also learn the business. And ultimately, what Madam Sarah Breedlove did, she married a gentleman with the last name of Walker. That's where that name sort of comes in. What she ultimately did was she took Annie Malone's formula and she slightly modified it. Once again, claiming that this sort of vision came through a dream, and she produced her own line of hair care products. Where she was exceptional, though, was not just that her product might have been slightly better than the recipe that she may or may not have ripped off from Annie Malone, it's that she was a magnificent, magnificent advertiser. All right, she advertised her product. She put her face right on the front of it. She created a brand. And because of the fact that, no white businesses were catering to this market, this was an open market that she entered and she came to dominate. And she's important in her own right. She becomes the first female black millionaire in the United States. She buys an estate right down the road from Rockefeller, I believe. She's neighbor with John D. Rockefeller. She arrives, right? She moves. Ultimately, you see her in the car. Her daughters and her move to Harlem, right? They're involved in sort of the sort of Harlem Renaissance and that scene. And she's a wonderful story. But this lecture is not just about the elites. One of the amazing things that Madam C.J. Walker did is she empowered other black women to become entrepreneurial as well. She hired what she called Walker agents, people who had used her product and believed in her product in the way that she believed in Annie Malone's product, and she brought them in and trained them and taught them how to go out and be entrepreneurial, go door to door and sell her product to other women who might need it, right? And that was very successful for her, but it was also very successful for those women. And every year, once she got really well established, once she established her factories, etc., she would bring those women up for a convention and she would tell them, I hope you're not here next year because I hope you have raised and made enough money and enough capital that you can go out and create your own business and create more jobs, right? And so I don't have numbers on how many Walker agents did that. We know anecdotally that many did. But Madam C.J. Walker, through her entrepreneurial spirit, created tens of thousands of jobs for Black women. And then those women went out and created tens of thousands of jobs in and of themselves, right? And so there's this sort of beautiful empowerment, right, that emerges from her efforts. Once again, right, the state is completely at odds with Black Americans. But because we don't have a top-down socialist economy controlled by the racist white elites, right? We have a market economy. There is room, opportunity for people to be entrepreneurial and overcome, make money, become educated, right? And live good and meaningful lives. And to build that foundation so that future generations can hopefully bring about political and civil equality. Another part of our story is one that's often overlooked in history textbooks, and that's the story of Black mutual aid societies. I'm a student of Dr. David Beto, who's a historian at the University of Alabama, has written some really amazing work on mutual aid societies. He has a book called Mutual Aid in the Welfare State about how Americans of all stripes used to provide social insurance, health care, retirement, life insurance to for one another through these voluntary associations prior to the welfare state being sort of top down implemented in the 1930s in the United States. And one of the things that we see in the 1880s, 1890s, the early 1900s is the emergence of these Black mutual aid societies. And these are a lot like if you've ever heard of the Masons, right? There's something along those lines, oftentimes organized around profession, where people would come together and they would all contribute a certain amount of money to the general pool. They would hire a doctor, and then that doctor would be paid or retained or fired based upon the health outcomes of the community that he or she served. And so they did that for health insurance. They did that for health care. They did it for life insurance. They did it for an array of other things. Black Americans had mutual aid societies as well. Oftentimes they were excluded, not shockingly, from the white mutual aid societies, and so they had to form their own. And Black mutual aid societies were interesting because they also had a political dynamic and an educational dynamic. Not only would they bring people together to sort of teach skills, to pull resources, to assist one another, to form fellowship and community, but they would also use these meetings to train and teach one another about the Bill of Rights, about the Declaration of Independence, about the Constitution, about important that were put into place after the Civil War, but were no longer being acknowledged by the federal government and by the courts. And so it's both an economic arrangement, but also a political and sort of educational arrangement whereby Black Americans are becoming educated. They're learning how to be leaders, political leaders within their associations. It's also a place, interestingly enough, where many Black lawyers got their start. Because one organization, the Black Elks, when Black Americans tried to join the Elks, which was a white-only civil society, they were rejected. And so they formed their own civil society and they just called it the Black Elks. Well, they got sued by the white civil society for stealing, quote unquote, their name. So as a result, Black lawyers had to be brought in, had to be trained up, and had to go and fight for the preservation of their name, the Black Elks. And Black lawyers successfully defeated the Elks at the Supreme Court and preserved their name. A lot of the lawyers who ultimately end up going into the NAACP and being leaders in the NAACP and pursuing that legal strategy for liberation got their start in these Black mutual aid societies, especially the Black Elks. The mutual aid societies are important as well because they're a place where people can come together, but they're also a place where all those resources, right, from these entrepreneurs can there's a political apparatus that can say, okay, we've got all these members who are willing to contribute $5 each to a cause. We can raise you $1 million to help support, if you will, right, the black community in Montgomery while they fight the racist busing laws, right? So they're the ones who are going to have like the today you might say like the email list, right? Of all the people who could potentially donate to a cause. So that's going to be really, really important. By 1920, more than 2 million Black Americans belonged to mutual aid societies, and they owned around $22 million worth of property. Now, there's still massive wealth disparity and income disparity in the United States at this time, but they're beginning to, as a community and as a collective, obtain enough capital that they can use that capital towards an organized effort, right, at resistance. Booker T. Washington lives to see the foundation of the NAACP. He and the NAACP had some significant disagreements about strategy, and he ultimately does not join the NAACP. He's nearing the end of his life. He's afraid that such a blatant sort of public challenge to the status quo of Jim Crow in the American South could be a backlash upon Tuskegee. And so he doesn't, unfortunately, become a founding member of the NAACP. But the NAACP is going to take over from Booker T. Washington, who dies, I believe, of heart disease just a couple years later, and also just stress and crazy amounts of travel. I mean, you read about his life, it's incredible. How much stress he had to operate under at all times. But instead of the sort of leader of the race going to W.B. Du Bois or to another individual, um, it ultimately falls upon this organization, the NAACP, to be the sort of leader of the race, if you will, moving forward. And the NAACP is, I think, strategically important because you see, not for the first time, but maybe for the first time formally, white and black advocates for black civil and economic equality coming together, and political equality, all coming together under one roof. So it's a multiracial, right, effort. It's not just Black Americans trying to liberate themselves. It's a multi-racial effort of people who are coming together who believe in promoting individual liberty, which is really important, I think, for minority movements to bring in members of the majority to the extent that you can to try and help promote the cause, right? And many of these founders of the NAACP were classical liberals in their bent, right? Warfield Story, Oswald Garrison Willard, like these are people who in the 19 teens and 20s were classical liberals who believed in markets, who believed in non-interventionism in foreign policy, who believed in civil liberty and individual rights. And so they're going to do their best throughout the 1920s to try and bring about victories through the courts. So the strategy shifts a little bit from Washington's sort of emphasis on economics and education to sort of an emphasis on going through the courts to try and bring about change. I want to just briefly mention this episode because sometimes when I give this talk, people think I'm being too optimistic about the prospects for minorities to overcome discrimination, right, in a market-based economy. And I always throw this out there because if you read my book, like our book, chapter 4 deals with atrocities committed against Black Americans in great detail. But I actually think this is an important thing to acknowledge for classical liberals. Um, and that is that markets are not enough. Markets are not enough without the rule of law. Markets are very powerful. We've already seen examples of how powerful markets can be at lifting people out of poverty, giving them opportunities to achieve educational attainment, right? Giving them opportunities to collaborate together. We see how powerful markets can be. And Black Tulsa or Greenwood, or as it was known at the time, Black Wall Street, was an example of that amazing, amazing opportunity that markets provide, that market capitalism provides. But time and time again in the American South, you would see the emergence of a really prosperous, very prosperous community of Black Americans who were entrepreneurial, who had gone out and done everything that Booker T. Washington told them to do. They become respectable. And as they gained wealth and respectability, they weren't accepted. In fact, the opposite happened. It led to envy. by the majority white population in a place like Tulsa. And that envy, if you don't have the rule of law to protect the right to life, liberty, and property, can spill over into tragedy. And that's exactly what happened in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when following false allegations, we think false allegations about a young black man supposedly sexually assaulting a young white woman, which led to calls for him to be lynched, which led to a conflict between local blacks and local whites in front of the courthouse, which led to people with guns firing them at one another, which ultimately led the next morning on June 1st to a mob of angry whites storming into the black part of town, burning it down and killing the number we're not entirely sure, but between 300 and 500 black Americans, destroying, burning down their property, etc. So I want to acknowledge that markets alone, right, without the rule of law, respect for individual liberty and rights, police protections for property, aren't going to get us the outcomes we want. But markets sure do a heck of a lot better than the alternative, which would be a command economy under the control of the racist majority, which would have been absolutely catastrophic for Black Americans. And I don't know how they would have ever, ever, ever achieved liberation in that type of an arrangement. The 1920s were pretty good times in terms of economically for Black Americans, just like they were for most Americans. The 20s, the roaring 20s, right? We had Harding and Coolidge in office. They had low taxes, massive amounts of deregulation, had some other bad policies as well, a little bit too protectionist for my taste, and the advent of a pretty bad immigration policy. But nonetheless, the 1920s were a pretty positive time economically for Black Americans. The 1930s, as you can imagine, as the Great Depression set in, was pretty dismal for Black Americans. And it was made worse by the legislative efforts, the regulatory efforts of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who passed a series of top-down reforms that he hoped would bring about some form of poverty alleviation, some form of opportunity, but oftentimes turned out to benefit whites while not benefiting Black Americans. And there are several reasons for that. I'll just talk about three very briefly. The National Recovery Administration, which is the closest the United States has ever come to formulating something akin to a fascist system, discouraged competition and instead encouraged cooperation among corporations. And so what that did is it set wages and set prices, and it allowed the largest corporations in the U.S. economy, in conjunction with racist labor unions, to establish wage rules, etc. And because it privileged the labor unions, which were disproportionately non-inclusive of Black Americans, many Black Americans were actually priced out of the market. If you've read Milton Friedman or Gary Becker, you know that, one of the things that markets allow minorities to do is offer a lower wage. Now that sounds terrible, I know, but it allows them to become employed. But if you set the wage, right, the same for everyone, now the only opportunity that a Black American would have in order to get a job and, at a factory, etc., without being a part of the union is now gone. And so a disproportionate number of Black Americans found themselves harmed by the National Recovery Administration, which, thank God, was ruled unconstitutional a few years later. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, just briefly, paid farmers not to farm. Could have a whole lecture on the insanity of some of these programs. What happened there is basically white farmers who owned a disproportionate amount of the land. They decided to not plant the land that they had hired sharecroppers to plant previously. If you know anything about Southern history, you know that sure there are a lot of poor white sharecroppers, but there's a disproportionate percentage of sharecroppers who are Black. And so as a result, many Black farmers were thrown off the land as an unintended consequence of the AAA's policy. And then the third one, of course, is the Federal Housing Act, which, of course, ultimately established redlining in the United States and discouraged loans to heterogeneous. It encouraged homogenous neighborhoods. So it discouraged integration and actually led to massive amounts of segregation post civil rights all across the United States in places like California and Minneapolis and St. Paul, etc. So these types of things did not ultimately benefit Black Americans. Social Security was extended mainly to jobs that white Americans occupied. The things that Black Americans predominantly did, housework, sharecropping, etc., were not a part of Social Security initially. They were added later. So the 30s were pretty tough. There were some small victories that Roosevelt contributed to, but they were pretty small compared to what Black Americans had hoped for. World War II is a turning point for Black Americans because um, during the war, Black publications and newspapers began a campaign called Double V, Victory Abroad and Victory at Home. And it basically stood for, we want to defeat fascism, a racialized regime, if there's ever been one, abroad. But we also want to draw attention to the fact that it is an absolute hypocrisy for the United States to go abroad, to send black men abroad to fight fascism and racism, and to have our own racist regime in the form of Jim Crow here in the United States. And so these black newspapers attempted to call attention to this hypocrisy. And I have to say, I do believe in the minds of middle white America, um, racial hierarchy was discredited by the Nazi regime. And after 1945, there were no real intellectual or, sort of justifications. There were maybe other justifications that were fallacious. But the ideological or the sort of racist hierarchical justifications, I think, were eroded because everyone in the United States was opposed to fascism, right? Some 1.2 million Black Americans ultimately served in the armed forces during World War II, and when they returned home, they became important leaders for the very, very early stages of the civil rights movement. We started the lecture talking about 1905 and how Black Americans were unable to desegregate the streetcars. In 1955, as you all know, they were successful. The catalyst for that movement, the thing that led Black Americans and white Americans, a large number of them, to come together to form a coherent and cohesive civil rights movement, was the murder of this young man, this boy, Emmett Till. In August of 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till went down to Mississippi to visit his grandmother and his extended family. He lived in Chicago. And while he was there, he and some friends went into a white-owned gas station. And according to the accounts, later redacted, by the way, of the white woman who was checking them out, he supposedly catcalled her or did a cat whistle, something along those lines, and sort of, made some sort of lewd comment towards her. She told her husband and her brother, and the two of them, along with another individual, tried to figure out where this young man was staying. Took them a couple days. They figured it out. They showed up at his grandmother's house in the middle of the night. They knock on the door. She opens it up. They push past her. They go up the stairs. They grab young Emmett Till, who had to have been horrified. They throw him in the back of their truck, and they drive him in the middle of the night to a barn where they beat him, eventually put a significant number of bullet holes in him, and dumped his body, his mutilated body, into the Tallahatchie River, where it was discovered a few days later. I apologize about the graphic images, but I think it's important for people to see what Emmett Till looked like ultimately when his body was retrieved. His mother had a decision to make whether or not to have an open casket at his funeral. She ultimately decided to have that, and she called up a black publisher, an entrepreneur in his own right, who had built a massive, massive, massive fortune, right, running Ebony and Jet magazine. And she asked John H. Johnson, "Sir, will you show the photographs? Will you come and photograph, and will you publish those photographs of what they did to my boy?" John H. Johnson, his memoir says the most difficult decision he ever had to make, whether or not to use his publishing empire to make this type of political case. He thought it was too great of an injustice not to do it. And so that's where this photograph ultimately reached millions of Americans. And there was an echo, a rallying cry across the United States, right? No more Emmett Tills. There'll be no more Emmett Tills. The man on the left is T.R.M. Howard in the middle. He's standing there next to Emmett Till's mother. He is a hardcore libertarian. Okay. He believes in his Second Amendment rights and he brings her down there and she stays at his estate and he protects her against the white citizen mob with young black men with semi automatic weapons. Basically says, you want her? You come get her. You'll see. You'll find out. All right. You want to mess with us? You'll find out. And so he and his sort of network and through the voluntary associations are able to get her to court safely. There is a trial. Unfortunately, an all-white jury finds the men not guilty. Just a few years later, they sold their story for a few $1,000s and admitted to doing the entire thing. But because of double jeopardy, which I generally think is a good sort of institutional rule, but in this case comes off really bad, right? They weren't able to be retried. TRM Howard is so outraged by the fact that these men were not brought to justice that he starts touring across the American South and going to black churches and delivering speeches about how black Americans need to come together in a civil rights movement, how they need to protest and boycott, use their economic means to push back against segregation. And he proposes a march on Washington years before it actually happens. He's invited by a young pastor to a church in Montgomery, Alabama. The pastor, of course, is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And sitting in the front row that night, or one of the front rows that night, was a young seamstress, Rosa Parks, who heard TRM Howard's call to action. The rest, as they say, right, is history. Rosa Parks later said that she was thinking about Emmett Till when she refused to give up her seat on that bus. And so that sparked the civil rights movement. That atrocity sparked the civil rights movement. And the means by which Dr. King and other civil rights leaders went about trying to fight for civil rights was very much reliant upon black economic power, voluntary associations, civil society, etc. My students sometimes tell me that the federal government liberated black Americans. And I always have to push back and say, no, no, no. Black Americans liberated themselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marcus. It was really really personal because I also come from an oppressed community in my region in India, and one of the Hindu saints in my region who emphasized the importance of entrepreneurship to my people, to my great grandfathers, had empowered them to come out of the caste oppression which they were facing. Let me begin with my first question, and meanwhile, audience can drop in their questions. My first question would be like about globalization and the impact of that. I mean, in the sense, did global trade or any kind of trade beyond the local communities enabled them to give the Black Americans more market access beyond the typical traditional restricted markets, um, and easing their process of finding demand, like finding more marketplace. That would be my first question. I see Rubin had some questions as well. Like, yeah, we will take one by one. Yeah.
Okay. So the way, let me restate your question and make sure I know exactly what you're asking before I answer it. So are you wondering like what is the role of globalization today for Black businessmen and women and are you curious like about how once there was integration, Black Americans no longer now that Black customers could shop at white stores. Are you interested in knowing like how that affected Black businesses? Because like Madam C.J. Walker was successful because she kind of had a corner on the market, right? But that wouldn't necessarily be the point after integration. Sorry, just a point of clarification.
No, my particular point was like, say for example, if the commodity which they produce, like, could have find a market elsewhere, like in
Oh,
another country or so, then I mean, these kind of discriminations or like this kind of discriminations are based on false illusion in this created by birth, and like if they are not in the local context, then this discrimination doesn't exist anymore.
ah,
So yeah, I mean, I was wondering if that contributed in any way in their business success of any of their businesses.
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent question. I think you're absolutely right about that, right? If you can get beyond the locality or beyond the nation, right? If you can trade with people who don't care about the color of your skin, they just care if you can provide a good product, right? And sort of the Milton Friedman sort of view, right? He always said, markets don't care what color you are, what your religion is. They care whether or not you can provide a good or service that other people want to buy. I think you're absolutely right about that. That could be very empowering. What I will say is that in and around the time that we're talking about, the United States had pretty heavy tariffs. They were beginning to liberalize, but there were tariffs there. So there were some restrictions, but Black Americans obviously did sell their services and their products abroad, and they were supported by the great industrialists. And I think that's really important. The people who made their fortunes through international trade and exchange, those quote unquote robber barons, as they're cast by some people in the 1880s and 90s, people like Andrew Carnegie, people like Rockefeller and others, they actually were the biggest supporters of black liberation, if you will. They might not have supported like political and civil sort of disruption or protests, but they definitely supported, right, the educational arrangements. Booker T. Washington was always up north lobbying for money, and it was the great industrialists who engaged in international trade and were not dependent upon Southern markets and Southern consumers for their profits. So I think there's something very much to that.
So I have hello. I have a question too. You describe the golden age of Black entrepreneurship in a way. In your estimation, what was the biggest factor that, in a way, ended that era? Was it like changes or more of a cultural shift?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that is quite the conundrum because if you look at Black progress, if you look at Black economic progress, if you look at like sort of the trend lines, they were closing the gap with white Americans up until around 1964, 1965. And that is somewhat ironic because, of course, in 1964, we have the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, we have the Voting Rights Act. And so Rachel and I, one of the things that we attempted to do is try to explain, like, well, what happened, right? Why didn't that progress persist after Black Americans gained civil rights and gained voting rights, at least in the South, right? Why didn't it continue? And we think that there are an array of reasons why it didn't continue, most of them political, and most of them institutional, policy-based sort of reasons. One is this sort of continuation of housing discrimination that we see earlier persists into the 1960s and the 1970s. It doesn't get better for a while. Um, we see also, though, the advent of the war on drugs in the United States, in which disproportionately affected Black men. And we could pull the data on that and demonstrate that, I think, pretty clearly. And so we have that, which is very, very detrimental to the family. Black Americans got married at as high a rate as white Americans all the way up until the 1960s. And then it began to decline. We think another part of the story is the Great Society and the incentives that the Great Society welfare state sort of created in terms of receiving benefits, right? The sort of incentives that bias themselves towards not being married. And it's also important to note, though, that just because marriage rates are declining doesn't mean that the male partner is not a part of the home, right? And in fact, we found that if we just looked at marriage rate, it overstates the lack of presence of the other partner. Another element of it, the cultural element of it, that Rachel would be better suited to speak to than me, is of course the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and the effects that birth control and no-fault divorce had upon marriage rates and upon the family. And what I will say to that is that that affected white, black, Latino, Asian Americans, all races. It affected all of them. It happened first, it seems like, in among Black Americans. But if you look at the trends, all of the things that people were commenting on in the 1990s about the Black family are now happening in the white family and elsewhere. So I think it's an array of different things, Ruben. I'm not sure if I like satisfactorily answered your question,
Yes.
but we definitely think that those policy initiatives hurt. And then one more I'll mention is just the highway system was run oftentimes through vibrant and thriving Black communities, and basically segregated parts of the country that would not have been segregated otherwise, places like St. Paul, Los Angeles, etc.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Another interesting doubt I had from what I was listening to you was the idea of equality of permission as described by many of the libertarian economists. They see equality of permission as a precondition for market participation, or but like in your work, it seems like I mean there are a bunch of rights for the people, but then there is no full equality of permission, but still they are enabled to be entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs are then creating the equality of permission um, as an effect as an output of their entrepreneurial pursuit. So like, do you think equality of permission, I mean, you briefly also mentioned about capitalism being capitalist system, being as an enabler of certain equalities of permission. How do you see it? Like, do you think it is a precondition, or a constitution is a precondition for this kind of things, or like, do you think it's the other way around?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I'm completely familiar with the literature that you're citing, right? The equality of permission, right? But I think what the way I'm understanding this, and how I'm understanding this to mean is, are property rights a precondition for entrepreneurship? Is that what you're?
Uh, I I mean I see you mentioned property rights as a precondition in your work, but like, yeah, this is a concept where, yeah, basically having equal permissions to you, as you were mentioning in your book also, like about contracts, like having permission to draw contracts. Do you think those conditions are essential, like, and the capitalist society is the only one which provides that, and that's what enabling the broader rights later on?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think if I think it could emerge spontaneously in a place where you didn't have those things, right, sort of protected. You didn't have equal access, right, to the right to contract, and I think it would be very difficult. It'd be much more difficult in a place where you didn't have those things recognized. I think institutions are absolutely fundamental and key to development. Having said that, I think you could develop informal institutions, right, that could potentially take the place of formal um, could attempt to take the place of formal recognition, right, of sort of the right to try, a right to go and chuck and barter, protection of property, right to contract. Like you could potentially have those things emerge, and they do emerge in places where there is no rule of law, and and other things like that. But I think that your outcomes are going to be much worse, right? It's going to be much harder to achieve the types of things that Black Americans achieved in a place that doesn't have that firm constitutional grounding. And so I think those formal institutions are really important for getting the types of outcomes that Black Americans were able to achieve here. Um, if you didn't have those types of formal institutions in place, then the incentives are going to be very wonky in terms of what people do with their capital and with their profits and with other things like that. So maybe like in Brazil, if you have, I'm thinking of the work of Hernando De Soto is sort of I think I messed up his name, Hernandez de Soto. Is that right? I'm thinking of this question about development and like titles, right? Like if you don't have the title to your property, you've just been squatting and like but you don't have the title, like what do you ultimately do in terms of like, do you invest that money back into your property? You can't sell it. You can't use it you can't get equity. You're not building equity. Like, so there's all these different ways in which people then invest their money and spend their money. And you don't see like the emergence of, sort of like property ownership and sort of using that type of personal equity to start businesses and stuff. So I think without the formal constitutional arrangements, right, it's going to be really difficult. Same thing like without sound currency, right, or stable currency, it's going to be really, really hard. So we see in some places, people, when they get their check, they instead of saving it and then using savings as investment later on, they like buy bricks and start adding on to their house because the bricks are tangible. They'll be worth something in the future. Whereas like the money might not be worth something in the future. And so I think those formal institutions are extremely, extremely important in order to sort of provide that equality of permission so that people can go and have a go and be adventurous. But I think that like the human spirit is really incredible, and so I don't want to, poo-pah like people who don't have that, like that they can't achieve things. And I do think that the sort of globalization and the sort of like, sort of, the ability to access like micro loans and to access broader credit markets and having Bitcoin, which, can provide stable current, all those things are great for people in developing countries who don't have the sort of stable the stability and the formal constitutional constraints and rights that would allow them to be prosperous.
I have another question, which I think does tie in with what you just mentioned. So you discussed how redlining prevented Black people to actually own homes, but like since zoning laws today restrict in a way housing supply, would you say that in a way ending zoning laws would be one of would be an important step to try to bridge those inequalities?
Yes, absolutely. The ways in which, let me just say just briefly, and I'll approach the president here in a moment. Let me just briefly say that the ways in which the redlining hurt Black Americans is that the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, would not provide insurance, right, to any bank, to any private bank loans that were given to properties in those areas, right? And so they didn't tell them you can't, as a private bank, make the loan, but it was heavily, right. The risk factor was so much greater with minority neighborhoods that it was really, really difficult. So I just want to clarify that. But I think you're absolutely right. I would like to be a zoning abolitionist. I would like to go that far. I'm in my old age. I become more moderate in terms of what I think is achievable. But there's no doubt that when I teach, survey of economics, which is intro to econ for non-majors, I always talk about. They're like, why are houses so expensive? I'm like, because we don't have enough housing. Why don't we have enough housing? Because of zoning laws. And so, that's a battle that's going to have to be sort of won in thousands of localities across the United States where people are going to have to organize, go to their local, meetings or sort of city meetings and argue that we need to relax zoning laws and density requirements and things like that so that we can get more housing built so that people have a chance at what we call the American dream, right? Owning your home is an essential part of building the wealth, or at least it historically has been, that is intergenerational, right? And I think that's one of the big reasons there's such a wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans, is because for so long Black Americans were denied, to a large extent, home ownership. I also just want to mention briefly that the majority of Black Americans are solidly middle class today. And so that's really important to mention, that most Black Americans, the stereotypical Black American, a suburban home, a two-car garage, things have improved significantly. But this home ownership question is, I think, really important for that intergenerational wealth issue. And it's also really important, I think, for allowing millennials, but especially Gen Z, an opportunity, right, at the same American dream that their fathers, that their grandparents had.
Thank you very much.
And I think we are running out of time. Like, I mean, this is a very interesting topic, and thank you so much for your valuable contribution. This is also very insightful for like future scholars, like the framework you laid out, like the way you articulated in your book and also in your talk, how you think about the things can be applied in many contexts and different situations. As I was also mentioning initially, whether it's LGBTQ community or other oppressed communities, historically oppressed communities in different regions, and like if you really study the history, it's not socialism which enabled them, like although the left would very much like to build such narratives, this kind of factual storytelling from the history is very essential, as building the counter narratives and like bringing the facts to the table, and understanding people to build better future also. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for your insightful answers to our humble questions. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. And I just want to say on behalf of Fee, please scan the QR code and fill out the survey because I know they would like the survey. Thank you so much again for having me.